Hello, my dear wanderers. It's Soren. Welcome back. Tonight we journey to the misted slopes of the Andes, where cloud forests breathe in silence and the air hums faintly with rain. Among those veiled ridges, a single tree holds a secret so bitter it reshapes empires and maps alike. Its bark, pale and fragrant, carries whispers of healing and conquest, of fevered nights and fragile hope. So before you drift into sleep, take a moment to like and subscribe, only if this brought you calm. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's drift into tonight's journey together. Some stories begin with heroism, or romance, or invention. This one begins with a taste so unpleasant that it could make even the most stoic sailor wince. It's the taste of quinine, the bitter alkaloid drawn from the bark of a South American tree that shaped empires, saved lives, and rewired global history, one tiny, reluctant sip at a time. It's not exactly the kind of bedtime story that promises comfort, but it's the kind that unfolds slowly, almost hypnotically, in a haze of fog, fever, and bureaucracy, long before pharmacists bottled it, before soldiers swallowed it, and long before gin and tonic turned it into an after-work ritual. Quinine was just bark, specifically the bark of the Cinchona tree, a quiet resident of the Andean cloud forests in modern-day Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador. The trees clung to steep ravines and damp ridges where sunlight was a rumor. Their bark held a secret, the ability to reduce fever, particularly the kind of fever that came in waves, left one shivering and sweating by turns, and sometimes ended in death. For centuries, indigenous peoples of the Andes had known this bark intimately. They called it kaina or kaina, the word rolling off the tongue with the same faint bitterness as the bark itself. Healers among the Quechua and Amara learned which trees were worth harvesting, which slopes produced the strongest medicine, and when to strip the bark without killing the tree. They tested with taste and texture. An empirical science passed from one generation to the next. Long before chemistry gave it a formula, to taste the right bark was to bite into winter, sharp, cold, and unmistakably alive. This practical knowledge, one part observation, one part patience, might have remained tucked away in the high forests, if not for the restless global networks of the 17th century. Jesuit missionaries arrived in those same mountains with their Bibles, notebooks, and a worrying tendency to catch tropical fevers. In their letters home, some Jesuits wrote of a miraculous bark that cured the shakes and sweats that plagued Europeans who dared to live near the equator. The word spread through mission networks and merchant fleets until the bark became a global commodity, sailing out of Peru's ports under the name Peruvian bark or Jesuits' powder. Europe's relationship with this medicine was, to put it gently, complicated. In an age when most doctors still believed disease was caused by imbalances of hot, cold, wet, and dry humors, a medicine that simply worked without aligning to the theory was unsettling. Many Protestant physicians distrusted anything associated with Jesuits, suspecting a Catholic plot in every spoonful. But those who actually tried the bark noticed something inconveniently persuasive. Patients stopped dying. The Jesuits, ever practical, didn't need chemical explanations. They just knew that fever abated, and so they packed the bark onto ships heading for Spain. Somewhere in this slow exchange of ideas and materials, a legend took root, one involving the Countess of Cinchona, the wife of a Spanish viceroy in Peru, supposedly cured of fever by the bark and carrying it home to Europe in grateful tribute. The story was likely embellished. Historians now suspect it was more marketing than fact, but it stuck. And when the Swedish botanist Carl Linnaeus later formalized plant names, he chose Cinchona in her honor. So a perhaps fictional noblewoman found herself immortalized in Latin, her name twined forever around the world's most famous bark. Once the bark arrived in Europe, it did not fit neatly into anyone's tidy worldview. Apothecaries measured and remeasured, trying to make sense of its potency. Merchants fought to secure steady supplies from South America, while governments, especially those with colonial ambitions, quietly realized that this bitter powder might be worth more than silver. Malaria was the silent killer of empire. Soldiers could conquer a coastline, but not the mosquitoes that waited inland. Without quinine, even the most ambitious expeditions fell apart under fever. By the late 17th century, powdered cinchona bark had traveled across Europe, into court pharmacies and military chests. Some loved it, some distrusted it. All noticed its taste. The bitterness was legendary. One English physician described it as a bark that protests its own necessity. Patients sometimes refused to take it, preferring the fever to the flavor. That refusal would centuries later inspire the addition of sugar, soda, and gin, a tonic for the tongue as much as for the bloodstream. But for now, the bark remained pure medicine, ground into fine dust, its active components still unknown. Chemistry in the 17th century was more art than science. Physicians mixed bark with wine, honey, and assorted herbs, hoping the combination would be more palatable and perhaps more effective. Results varied wildly. Some bark was strong, some weak. Some shipments were so adulterated with fillers that they did nothing at all. Unscrupulous merchants stretched the supply with sawdust and counterfeit species. Patients noticed. Doctors complained. The British Royal Society argued over purity and dosage. Everyone agreed that it worked, sometimes, but no one could quite explain why. For indigenous collectors in the Andes, meanwhile, the bark's growing fame meant rising demand and increasing exploitation. European traders, eager to secure more supply, pushed deeper into the forests, often without regard for sustainable harvesting. Trees that had once been stripped carefully were now felled wholesale. Forest slopes that had taken centuries to mature began to thin. Local communities, who had once traded the bark on their own terms, saw their knowledge commodified and their forests depleted. Yet the global appetite only grew. By the 18th century, bark shipments crossed the Atlantic regularly. The British, French, and Spanish navies stocked it for tropical service. Jesuit missionaries carried it into Africa and Asia. The bark had become both spiritual and strategic currency, a cure blessed by heaven and measured by tonnage. In Europe's bustling port cities, barrels of powdered bark sat beside spices and tobacco. Another colonial harvest turned to gold. The next great shift came not from the jungle, but from the laboratory. In 1820, two French chemists, Pierre-Joseph Pelleteur and Joseph Bien-Aimé Caventou, working in Paris, managed to isolate the active ingredient. They dissolved, filtered, and precipitated until a fine white crystalline powder remained. They named it quinine, after the Kawaks word kawina. For the first time, medicine could be measured precisely, grain by grain, dose by dose. What had once been a mysterious plant became a molecule. It's hard to overstate how transformative that was. Quinine became one of the first natural products ever purified into a specific chemical substance. The discovery placed pharmacy firmly on the path toward modern chemistry. It also made dosing safer and more predictable. A few grains could save a life, too many could cause ringing ears, dizziness, or worse. Military doctors learned to walk the line carefully, and empires took notice. Quinine, now portable and standardized, changed the arithmetic of colonization. The phrase "the white man's grave," once used to describe West Africa, began to lose its grim accuracy. Before quinine prophylaxis, European mortality in tropical postings was catastrophic, sometimes half of all personnel within a year. After quinine, survival rates improved dramatically. That improvement, in turn, made it possible to build railways, plantations, and administrative capitals in regions that had previously resisted European occupation, not by arms but by fever. In short, a bitter bark became a geopolitical tool. It's not a particularly romantic legacy, but a revealing one. Quinine didn't just cure malaria, it enabled empire. It allowed armies to move inland, bureaucrats to stay longer, and investors to imagine profits from climates that had once killed them. The medicine of life for some became a mechanism of domination for others. History, as always, does not taste entirely sweet. As quinine's importance grew, so did the competition to control its source. The Cinchona trees of South America became targets for botanical espionage. The Andean republics that emerged after independence tried to protect their native species, but foreign collectors had other ideas. One of them, an English adventurer named Charles Ledger, managed through local contacts and some questionable ethics to obtain seeds of a particularly high-yield species. Those seeds eventually reached the Dutch, who planted them in their East Indies colony on the island of Java. Java's climate proved nearly perfect. Within a few decades, Dutch plantations were producing the majority of the world's Cinchona bark. The monopoly was near total. British attempts to replicate it in India never quite matched the yield. By the early 20th century, if you wanted quinine, you probably bought it from the Netherlands. Even the British Army did. The empire that never wanted to depend on anyone found itself quietly importing life from its rival's colony. The plantations themselves were orderly, scientific, and of course, exploitative. Indigenous Javanese workers harvested bark in regimented cycles, peeling and drying it for shipment to Europe. Laboratories in Amsterdam and Rotterdam refined it further, exporting quinine sulfate to pharmacies and military depots around the world. The trade was steady, profitable, and deeply colonial. Through all of this, malaria remained stubbornly present. Quinine was a treatment, not a vaccine. It cured the fevers and reduced mortality, but it did not stop reinfection. Colonial doctors prescribed it liberally, sometimes as daily prophylaxis, sometimes as emergency medicine. Soldiers and administrators learned to swallow it with grim resignation. Its side effects, tinnitus, nausea, and the odd shimmering in vision, were familiar companions. Still, most preferred the discomfort to death. Eventually, someone had the bright idea of making the medicine taste less awful. By the mid-19th century, British officers in India mixed their quinine doses with sugar, water, and citrus. The result was tonic water. To make it tolerable, they added gin, and just like that, an imperial necessity became a cocktail. The gin and tonic was born not in celebration, but in medical compromise, a small fizzy rebellion against the taste of survival. Behind the clinking ice, however, the global system that sustained quinine was beginning to strain, overharvesting in South America. Disease on the plantations and the inevitable politics of war would eventually threaten supply. Yet for now, quinine reigned as the queen of medicines, its crystals gleaming under gaslight, its bitterness hidden behind bubbles. That's the quiet paradox at the heart of this story. a cure that came from the forest, was turned into a tool of empire. The people who had first discovered it lost control over it, and the same molecule that saved countless lives also enabled centuries of conquest. The world rarely divides neatly into heroes and villains. It divides into supply chains and shipping manifests, into forests cut down for bark and factories that filled glass vials labeled quinine sulfate. As the 19th century drifted into the 20th, and new wars loomed on the horizon, the world would learn how fragile even the most essential medicine could be when bound to empire. But that, like all good bitter stories, takes time to unfold. The world that quinine builds was not quiet. It hummed with the low, restless machinery of expansion: steamships, rail lines, colonial offices, plantations, and the endless bureaucratic rhythm of men who believed they were bringing order to tropical lands while nervously counting their doses. By the mid-19th century, quinine had become so bound to imperial life that it was almost invisible. Like humidity, it hung in the air, a chemical insurance policy against the world's most persistent parasite. To understand just how deeply this alkaloid shaped empire, it helps to look at malaria itself. The disease was ancient, documented since antiquity, but its reach in the colonial tropics was unmatched. On the coasts of Africa, in the jungles of India, and in the deltas of Southeast Asia, malaria was both a deterrent and a test. It was a disease of place, of standing water, heat, and mosquitoes that refused to care about maps. Armies feared it more than bullets. Engineers building canals and railways learned quickly that timetables meant nothing when half a workforce was delirious with fever, so quinine became standard issue. In the British Empire, bottles of quinine sulfate lined medical chests from the Caribbean to Calcutta. Soldiers took it with the same resignation as ration. Officers sometimes masked the bitterness with sugar or brandy, which at least made the routine vaguely sociable. The daily dose turned into ritual, a small, grim toast to survival. British colonial regulations eventually required it, though compliance was as uneven as the dosing itself. Those who skipped their spoonfuls often regretted it. In the French colonies, quinine was even more revered. The military physician Charles Leverin, who would later win the Nobel Prize, identified the malaria parasite itself in the 1880s, confirming what had long been suspected. Malaria wasn't just bad air, as the name suggested, but a living invader transmitted by mosquitoes. It was elegant and horrifying knowledge, a discovery that made quinine's importance undeniable. The drug didn't purify the air. It disrupted a parasite's chemistry. It was a tiny, targeted act of mercy hidden inside centuries of superstition. The parasite, of course, didn't care about imperial pride. It adapted to each attempt at control, settling into new reservoirs, waiting for lapses in prophylaxis or sanitation. Colonizers, convinced of their own rational mastery, built hospitals and laboratories that doubled as monuments to their anxieties. In tropical postings, medical officers drew meticulous charts tracking fever cases like stock prices, watching as spikes of infection coincided with lapses in quinine distribution. The economics of supply became political theater. Quinine might have been a French discovery, but the Dutch held the monopoly. Java's plantations were the beating heart of the world's quinine trade, exporting bark and refined alkaloids by the ton. The Dutch government ran the system with bureaucratic precision. Experimental plots tested new hybrids. Chemists measured alkaloid content with near-religious fervor. The entire operation was a monument to controlled bitterness. Meanwhile, in British India, Attempts to replicate the success faltered. The geography was wrong in subtle but important ways. The soil on the Himalayan slopes, though lush, lacked the perfect mix of drainage and mist found in Java. British botanists tried again and again, planting thousands of seedlings imported from South America or the Dutch colonies. Some grew, most sulked. The yields were low, the bark weak. It became a botanical version of keeping up with the neighbors, with all the same quiet humiliation. Yet, empire is nothing if not stubborn. The British compensated through sheer scale planting more trees, extracting less potent bark, and refining it in industrial quantities to make up for quality. What they couldn't grow, by the early 1900s, the Dutch supplied nearly all the quinine used by European powers. It was an awkward dependence dressed in polite trade agreements. As quinine solidified its role in medicine, it also became part of daily life for those who lived under empire. In colonial households, the evening gin and tonic served not just as refreshment, but as reassurance, a social ritual that blurred the line between medical regimen and leisure. The fizz and lime made the medicine palatable, and soon enough, fashionable. Newspapers printed advertisements for bottled tonic water, boasting its restorative qualities, which was code for "you'll feel less like dying." Manufacturers like Schweppes, and later others in India, marketed tonic water so successfully that the medicinal purpose faded into lifestyle. It's tempting to picture those verandas where bureaucrats in linen suits stared into the twilight and clinked glasses of diluted quinine, congratulating themselves for surviving another day. But behind each glass was a global web of extraction. The Andean collectors who had first stripped bark from trees, the Javanese laborers harvesting plantations, the chemists distilling powder in European laboratories. It's a strange symmetry. Millions of lives saved from fever, millions of others bent under colonial economics that the same medicine helped sustain. Quinine was both cure and currency. During the scramble for Africa in the late 19th century, its presence shaped maps. The European rush to claim territory below the Sahara coincided neatly with the availability of reliable quinine prophylaxis. Before that, mortality rates among Europeans in tropical Africa had been catastrophic, so high that some regions were simply considered uninhabitable for colonists. After quinine, they became manageable. The phrase has a certain bureaucratic chill to it, but it meant survival, and survival meant ownership. One of the most striking case studies comes from West Africa, where British and French colonial administrators carried quinine like a talisman. A few grains a day turned formerly deadly regions into viable trading posts. Ports expanded, inland routes opened, and soon malaria's reputation as the white man's grave began to fade. Not because the disease was conquered, it still ravaged local populations, but because quinine offered a selective shield for those with access. This disparity quietly reshaped public health policy. Colonial administrations began to see quinine not as a universal remedy, but as a resource to be allocated. Europeans received regular doses. Indigenous laborers often did not, in plantations and railway projects. Quinine distribution sometimes followed racial hierarchies, with predictable results. The very drug that could have reduced suffering across entire communities instead reinforced division. Empire, as always, had a way of turning medicine into privilege. By the early 20th century, the Dutch monopoly looked unbreakable. Their plantations in Java, aided by meticulous record-keeping and hybridization, produced bark with unprecedented quinine content. International markets responded accordingly. German, British, and French pharmaceutical companies refined the raw alkaloid into various salts, sulfate, hydrochloride, and bisulfate, each claiming superior solubility. Pharmacies displayed bottles of quinine pills beside tonics and lozenges. It was medicine turned brand. Then came war, and war never respects supply chains. When World War I disrupted global trade, shortages of quine rippled through military hospitals. The Allies scrambled for substitutes, experimenting with synthetic analogues like plasmoquine and mepacrine, but none matched quinine's reliability. Between the wars, as nations rebuilt, pharmaceutical research accelerated, driven by equal parts curiosity and strategic paranoia. Everyone understood that malaria could cripple armies as surely as artillery. By the time the Second World War began, quine was again a strategic resource. And in 1942, when Japan occupied the Dutch East Indies, it suddenly vanished from Allied supply lines. The world's primary source of quine was now in enemy hands. It's a detail easily overlooked in the sweeping narratives of that war. But for troops in the Pacific, it mattered more than tanks or planes. Malaria, once suppressed, surged back. In response, Allied scientists raced to develop synthetic substitutes. Laboratories in the United States and Britain dusted off interwar experiments, reviving compounds that had seemed second-rate only years earlier. Among them were tabrine, a bright yellow pill that left an equally yellow stain on skin and uniforms, and chloroquine, a promising derivative developed in Germany before the war. The results were mixed. The tabrine worked, but caused nausea and insomnia. Soldiers nicknamed it the lemon pill and swallowed it under protest. Commanders resorted to propaganda, telling troops that refusing the pill was unpatriotic. It was a peculiar intersection of chemistry and morale. Meanwhile, the forest that had once provided the world's quinine fell silent. Andean producers could not scale up quickly enough to replace the lost Javanese output. Expeditions were dispatched from the United States to South America to locate wild Cinchona stands, but the results were patchy. Bark collection was labor-intensive, and the trees grew in remote, nearly inaccessible valleys. The Cinchona missions, as they were called, were part scientific enterprise, part wartime scramble. Men hacked through jungles in Ecuador and Peru, hoping to find enough high-alkaloid bark to supply the front lines. This emergency effort marked a strange return to the medicine's origins. 3 centuries after Jesuit missionaries had carried the bark from the Andes to Europe, another group of outsiders went searching for the same trees. Now with maps, microscopes, and military orders, the irony was thick enough to taste bitter, naturally. Even after the war, when peace returned and global trade resumed, the quinine story didn't quite settle. Synthetic antimalarials like chloroquine gradually took over, cheaper to produce and easier to standardize. For a few decades, it seemed the bark's long reign was over. But history, like malaria, has a habit of recurring. By the late 20th century, resistance to synthetic drugs began to appear, and quinine found itself back in use, no longer an imperial symbol, but a humble fallback in hospitals across the tropics. Still, its legacy lingered in the landscapes it transformed. In Java, abandoned plantations overgrew with vines. In South America, patches of forest once stripped bare slowly regenerated. The quinine molecule, that tiny scaffold of carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen, had shaped centuries of human movement, trade, and conquest. And yet, in the end, it returned to anonymity, a chemical among millions, waiting in the pages of pharmacology textbooks for the next generation to rediscover its bitterness. When you follow the trail of quinine, you begin to see that it's less a story about medicine than about translation, from bark to powder, from Andes to empire, from fever to formula. Every translation gains something and loses something else. What began as local knowledge became a global commodity, then a symbol of control, and finally a cautionary tale. Drifting forward from those colonial verandas into the modern century, the story would change shape again, not through armies or plantations, but through science itself, as researchers traced malaria's life cycle and the curious chemistry of resistance that kept the old disease alive. The story slides now from the damp verandas of empire into quieter rooms, the laboratories where the modern age began to measure life in molecules. By the late 19th century, medicine was shifting away from folklore and into the precise hum of glassware, balances and journals with titles so serious they made even the most exciting discoveries sound like paperwork. Quinine sat at the center of that transition. What had once been the bark's mysterious virtue became the chemist's crystalline prize. After Pelletier and Cavento's isolation of quinine in 1820, laboratories across Europe turned to the challenge of understanding it. The molecule's complexity was daunting, even with all the solvents, acids, and patience of the 19th century. Chemists could barely describe its structure, let alone reproduce it. Still, it offered something irresistible, a clear, repeatable demonstration that nature's pharmacy could be quantified. You could hold a cure in your hand, weigh it, and share it across continents. That idea was intoxicating in its own calm way. By the 1840s, quinine had become the model for a new branch of science. Organic chemistry. Each crystal on a watch glass represented a kind of mastery over chaos. It also represented logistics, because producing quinine still depended on a tree that grew halfway round the world. Laboratories could refine and test, but they couldn't conjure bark out of thin air. For all its precision, chemistry remained tethered to the forest. Researchers spent decades mapping the molecule's structure. They learned that quinine belonged to a family of nitrogen-bearing compounds called alkaloids, chemicals that plants seemed to produce for no reason other than to keep animals slightly miserable. Caffeine, nicotine, morphine, and quinine all shared the same basic character: bitter, physiologically potent, and oddly essential to human history. By the time chemists realized this, most of them were already dependent on coffee, so no one complained. The drive to synthesize quinine to make it in the lab without relying on the Cinchona tree became a kind of scientific Everest. It symbolized complete control over nature's pharmacy. Early attempts failed repeatedly. Each new generation of chemists declared victory too soon, only to discover that they'd made something similar, but not quite right. Quinine's structure was a molecular knot, a delicate tangle that resisted simplification. The irony, of course, is that by the time someone finally managed a full laboratory synthesis in the 20th century, the world no longer needed it. Synthetic production was far more expensive than extracting quinine from bark, and newer antimalarials had already arrived. Still, the achievement had symbolic weight. In 1944, American chemists Robert Woodward and William During announced that they had achieved total synthesis, confirming the molecule's structure. Their paper read like a victory lap, quiet, elegant, and distinctly mid-century in its confidence that science could solve anything given enough glassware and coffee. Even before that, chemists had learned how quinine worked, at least in outline. The malaria parasite, Plasmodium falciparum, lived part of its life inside human red blood cells. There it feasted on hemoglobin, breaking it down for nutrients. The problem for the parasite was that hemoglobin's iron core, called hem, was toxic in free form. The parasite normally bundled it into harmless crystals, like tucking away broken glass. Quinine, being both clever and vindictive, slipped into that process and jammed it. The parasite, surrounded by its own unprocessed waste, quietly poisoned itself. It's a rather poetic mechanism, malaria destroyed by the chemistry of its own dinner. Understanding this took decades of microscopes and patient observation. In 1880, Charles Louis Alphonse Laveran, working in Algeria, was the first to actually see the parasite in human blood. He watched it wriggle, a discovery equal parts beautiful and unsettling. His work earned him a Nobel Prize, and it cemented quinine's reputation as a weapon not of mysticism, but of measurable biochemistry. The medicine didn't balance humors or ward off evil spirits. It interfered with metabolism, a word that sounded both modern and mercifully impersonal. In the decades that followed, malaria research became a strange blend of high science and field work. Doctors in tropical hospitals tested doses, noted side effects, and argued endlessly about quininism, the collection of symptoms that came with too much of a good thing. Patients on long-term prophylaxis reported ringing in their ears, dizziness, and sometimes hallucinations. The line between cure and toxicity was narrow enough to make every physician slightly uneasy. Yet in malarial zones the choice remained obvious: risk discomfort or risk death. By the early 20th century, the vocabulary of quinine had seeped into public consciousness. It was medicine, but also metaphor, a symbol for endurance and the slightly bitter aftertaste of progress. Its name appeared in poetry, in advertisements, even in jokes. Take your quinine became shorthand for doing something unpleasant but necessary. The world, apparently, had accepted that survival rarely tasted sweet. Then again, survival is rarely simple. The more scientists studied malaria, the clearer it became that the parasite was a master of adaptation. The quinine molecule worked beautifully against certain stages of infection, but left others untouched. In Plasmodium vivax, the parasite could hide in the liver for months, re-emerging long after symptoms seemed cured. No amount of quinine could reach those dormant forms. They waited, invisible, until conditions favored their return. It was biology with a sense of humor. When synthetic chemistry entered the picture in the early 20th century, researchers began designing compounds inspired by quinine structure. The idea was to preserve its effect, but remove its unpredictability and cost. The first real success was methacrene, also known as itaberine, a synthetic yellow pill developed in Germany in the 1930s. It worked reasonably well, though it left users with a disconcerting yellow tint and a general feeling that they'd swallowed a traffic signal. Later came chloroquine, smoother, cheaper, and blessedly colorless. The rise of synthetics might have marked the end of the Cinchona era, but the forest still held secrets. Even as chemists mapped the molecular battlefield, botanists were studying the trees themselves, tracing the genetic diversity of Cinchona officinalis, Cinchona legeriana, and their countless hybrids. Each species contained different alkaloid ratios, some richer in quinine, others in its cousins, like cinchonine and quinine. The Dutch, meticulous as ever, catalogued each variety, treating bark samples as data points in a global experiment. If this all sounds a little obsessive, it was. The plantation records from Java read like an accountant's dream diary. Tables of yield, rainfall, alkaloid percentages, and export tonnage. The human cost rarely appeared in those columns. Laborers stripped bark from trees in regimented cycles, their hands stained dark from sap, their wages meager. For them, quinine was not an emblem of scientific triumph, but of work, a bitter smell that clung to skin and season alike. When the Japanese occupation of the Dutch East Indies in 1942 cut off the world's supply, the abstraction became painfully real. Laboratories that once fussed over purity now found themselves desperate for raw material. American scientists launched what they called the Cinchona missions, sending botanists and soldiers alike into the Andes to find surviving groves. The missions had the energy of a treasure hunt and the ethics of a salvage operation. They located stands of wild trees in Peru, Ecuador, and Bolivia, collected seeds, and shipped tons of bark back through wartime blockades. It was, in essence, a return to the 17th century, European and American agents combing Andean forests for salvation. Local harvesters once again became the linchpins of a global enterprise. Quinine, which had once symbolized imperial mastery, now became the empire's own lifeline. The forests gave generously, but not indefinitely. Even wartime urgency couldn't hide the irony. The modern world still depended on the same bark that indigenous healers had used centuries earlier. When peace returned, the global pharmaceutical landscape had changed. Synthetic drugs like chloroquine were cheap, efficient, and easy to mass produce. Quinine, though still respected, lost its monopoly. In the post-war years, it lingered mostly in hospitals for severe malaria cases, and of course, in tonic water. The molecule that had once built empires now floated lazily in highball glasses, its bitterness softened by bubbles and lime. Still, in scientific circles, quinine never disappeared. Its chemistry became a template for studying optical activity, the way molecules twist polarized light. Its synthesis inspired generations of organic chemists. Even when malaria treatments shifted toward new drugs, quinine remained a benchmark, the quiet ancestor against which every antimalarial was measured. In that sense, it achieved a kind of immortality, not divine, but molecular. Drifting into the late 20th century, the story took another familiar turn. Resistance. Parasites that had once succumbed to chloroquine began to adapt, especially in Southeast Asia and South America. By the 1980s, resistance had spread so widely that quinine, the old standby, was called back into service. Doctors who had never expected to use it again found themselves ordering vials of quinine sulfate, relearning doses, and inevitably dealing with the same old side effect. History apparently had a taste for repetition. Even in this modern context, quinine carried traces of its past. In some hospitals, supplies were imported from the same Andean regions where the trees still grew wild. The chain from forest to pharmacy remained intact. If quieter, scientists began to see the broader lesson. Medicine, like empire, was only as stable as the ecosystems it depended on. When those forests declined, so did the security of the cure. The 20th century had turned quinine from miracle to molecule, from empire's secret weapon to pharmacological footnote. But the bark's influence persisted in chemical textbooks, in colonial archives, in the clink of a glass where bitterness had become nostalgia. If you listen closely, that bitterness still hums underneath the surface of modern medicine, reminding us that progress often begins with a taste we'd rather forget. And just as chemistry learned to isolate nature's secrets, conservationists and lawyers would soon learn that protecting them required more than glass and solvent. It required politics, patience, and sometimes an apology. By the time the 20th century settled into its long middle years, the Cinchona tree had become less a plant and more a ghost, a living emblem of what empires had taken and what they left behind. In the old Andean forests, where the bark had first been stripped, many slopes stood bare. The trees that had once grown in tangled clusters were now scattered like punctuation marks, reminders of a trade that had moved on without them. Some groves regenerated, others gave way to cattle pasture or small farms. The air still held that damp, mossy scent, but the forest's heartbeat had slowed. For most people, in South America, the Cinchona trade had never brought prosperity, only labor. Local collectors, once the stewards of the trees, found themselves replaced by outside companies or displaced by conservation laws that arrived too late to conserve much. The bark that had saved the world from malaria had also eroded the soil beneath it, literally and metaphorically. It was a common pattern of empire: extract, export, and move on when the resource was spent. Meanwhile, halfway around the world, the plantations in Java, the Dutch crown jewel of quinine production, stood as silent proofs of how much order could be imposed on nature when profit demanded it. Rows of Cinchona trees stretched along terraced hillsides, each labeled and measured. The Dutch colonial administration managed them with a precision that bordered on obsession. Every tree had a file. Every bark harvest was logged, weighed, and chemically tested. It was a world of ledgers and microscopes, where the local Javanese workers appeared mostly as footnotes. When the Second World War brought the Japanese occupation of Indonesia in 1942, that system collapsed almost overnight. Laboratories were abandoned, warehouses of bark went up in smoke or were seized by occupying forces. The Allied powers, suddenly cut off from their main quinine supply, faced a medical crisis. In the Pacific, malaria incapacitated more soldiers than enemy bullets. The global empire that quinine had once sustained now found itself begging for the same medicine it had built its dominance upon. Desperation drove improvisation. Allied botanists fanned out across South America again, gathering seeds and cuttings like treasure hunters retracing an old map. American military supply chains shipped Andean bark through Panama to laboratories that hurriedly extracted quinine for the front lines. It was a logistical miracle built on anxiety, and in a way, it was the empire's shadow. The same forest, the same bark, only now serving a new master. The Dutch plantations, when eventually restored after the war, never regained their global dominance. Synthetic chemistry had caught up. Chloroquine, mefloquine, and later artemisinin-based treatments offered cheaper and often more effective alternatives. Chlorine was still respected, but increasingly niche. A fallback, a relic, the medicine equivalent of a wise, but slightly outdated professor still holding office hours. Yet, the ecological cost of those old plantations lingered. The Cinchona tree, forced into monoculture, became vulnerable to disease and soil exhaustion. Genetic diversity narrowed. Plantation managers had favored only a few high-yield species. When fungal blights appeared in the mid-20th century, they swept through entire estates. The trees, once wild survivors of mountain mist, had become hothouse dependents. The empire's attempt to control nature had succeeded only in making it fragile. The story might have ended there, a neat arc from forest to empire to obsolescence. But human curiosity has a way of circling back. In the 1970s and 1980s, botanists began cataloging what was left of South America's native Cinchona populations. They found that wild trees still held genetic variations unknown to plantation stock. traits that might prove valuable for future medicine or reforestation. So the irony was thick. After centuries of taking bark, the world suddenly wanted to give something back. Conservationists faced a tricky question. How do you restore a species that was both over-harvested and globally transplanted? Replanting Cinchona in the Andes wasn't simply a matter of putting seedlings in the ground. The trees thrived only in narrow altitude ranges, where humidity and shade balanced perfectly. Too low, and they withered; too high, and frost took them. The Andean cloud forests were already under pressure from agriculture and logging, their delicate microclimates shrinking. Saving Cinchona meant saving everything around it: the mosses, orchids, and fog that made the place feel half dream and half laboratory. At the same time, a new kind of conversation was emerging around bioprospecting, a polite term for the search for useful natural compounds in biodiversity-rich regions. The old stories of quinine and empire were suddenly relevant again. Scientists and governments began to ask, who owns the knowledge of a plant's healing power? The Andean peoples who had first discovered the bark's value had received little recognition, let alone compensation for centuries of extraction. In the late 20th century, as debates over intellectual property and indigenous rights grew louder, quinine's history became a case study in how not to manage discovery. International agreements like the 1992 Convention on Biological Diversity and the later Nagoya Protocol tried to address this imbalance. They established the principle that nations, and often local communities, should share in the benefits when their biological resources or traditional knowledge lead to commercial products. It was, at least on paper, a form of restitution. Whether it worked in practice was another matter. Cinchona's own role in this new framework was more symbolic than practical. The drug was long out of patent and too old to generate new profits, but its story served as a cautionary tale. In the same way the Jesuit bark had been carried from the Andes to European pharmacies, countless other plants and compounds were being studied for modern pharmaceuticals. The difference was that now people were paying attention to where those plants came from and who had known them first. Even so, the past remained stubbornly present. In some parts of Peru and Bolivia, the descendants of the old bark collectors still knew where the wild cinchona grew. They harvested small amounts for local use, more tradition than trade. The bitter bark remained a household remedy for fever, though few could afford the laboratory-refined quinine it inspired. The global market had moved on, but the forest never quite let go of its secret. Meanwhile, in Europe and North America, quinine took on an oddly genteel afterlife. It became a flavor rather than a medicine. Bottled tonic water, now containing only a trace of quinine, transformed its once harsh bitterness into an aesthetic choice, a crisp note in a cocktail rather than a life-saving dose. The gin and tonic, born of necessity in the colonial tropics, became a symbol of quiet sophistication in suburban bars. Most drinkers never thought about malaria when they raised their glasses. The taste that had once spelled survival now evoked leisure. It's hard not to notice the irony. A substance that once shaped global health policy had been reduced to an accessory of happy hour. Yet the connection between bitterness and endurance remained. To sip tonic water was unknowingly to participate in a history that stretched from Andean healers to European chemists, from colonial soldiers to wartime laboratories. Each bubble in the glass carried the faint ghost of empire. In quieter corners of academia, the Cinchona story became a way to teach about globalization and ethics, the first truly international drug, both miracle and monopoly. It reminded students that every medicine has an origin story, and that those stories rarely belong to a single culture. The bark's journey from forest to formula was a microcosm of modern science. Translation, appropriation, and sometimes redemption. And redemption, though slow, was not impossible. In recent decades, reforestation projects in Ecuador and Peru have begun to reintroduce native Cinchona species, planting them alongside other cloud forest trees to restore the ecological mosaic. Local communities now lead some of these projects, combining traditional knowledge with modern conservation methods. The bark is no longer stripped for profit, but studied for preservation. In a quiet twist of fate, the same forests once mined for medicine have become laboratories for healing landscapes instead of bodies. The old colonial plantations in Java tell a similar story, though with a more bureaucratic flavor. Some still operate, producing small amounts of quinine for pharmaceutic use. Others have been converted into botanical research stations, their rows of trees left as historical curiosities. The Dutch colonial records, those endless ledgers of bark, yield and labor hours, now serve as data for environmental historians, tracing how humans have altered tropical ecosystems. The empire's paperwork, once written to control nature, has become evidence of how fragile that control always was. If there's a lesson drifting through all this, it's that science and empire are two sides of the same restless coin. Both rely on the belief that the world can be measured, improved, and possessed. The Cinchona tree resisted that idea for centuries. It grew only where the mist lingered and the soil stayed thin, far from the easy reach of roads. Its bark refused to give up its secrets until generations of hands, both indigenous and European, had tested, tasted, and learned its bitterness by heart. The world eventually moved on from the bark, but its shadow remains in every conversation about who owns knowledge, who benefits from discovery, and who pays when the forest runs out. Quinine may no longer be the centerpiece of global medicine, but the questions it raised have never stopped echoing. And as those echoes faded into the 21st century, a new chapter began, less about conquest and more about coexistence. As scientists, environmentalists, and local communities tried to rewrite the story of the bitter bark into something a little gentler, a little more forgiving, and maybe even a little hopeful. By the time the 21st century stretched its digital cables across the world, the quinine story had become quiet, almost background noise. The molecule that once decided the fate of armies was now a mild flavoring agent in boutique beverages, its name printed in fine script on glass bottles that caught the light in upscale bars. Most people encountered quinine not as a medicine, but as a trivia fact. Did you know tonic water glows under black light? That small party trick, courtesy of quinine's natural fluorescence, became its last theatrical flourish, a soft chemical ghost flickering in ultraviolet. But in laboratories and hospitals, the story still mattered. Malaria had not disappeared. It remained one of humanity's most stubborn companions, particularly across sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Southeast Asia, and the Amazon basin. Quinine was no longer the frontline drug. It had been largely replaced by artemisinin-based therapies, but it never vanished. Doctors kept it in reserve, a veteran still summoned when newer medicines failed. Its bitterness, both literal and historical, lingered. Modern medicine's relationship with quinine is strangely ambivalent. On paper, it's an old drug, thoroughly understood and thoroughly surpassed. Yet, in practice, it still saves lives when resistance undermines newer treatments. In severe malaria cases, when the parasite count climbs and the patient's organs begin to falter, quinine can still draw the fever back from the edge. Hospitals in remote regions, where supply chains are uneven and budgets thin, often rely on quinine because it's stable, familiar, and compared to advanced synthetics, forgiving of rough condition. Pharmaceutical companies, of course, prefer innovation. Patents drive profit, not nostalgia. So quinine now sits in that awkward space between heritage and utility, too old to patent, too valuable to forget. It's the aspirin of the tropics, a standby from another era that refuses to retire. In that sense, quinine has achieved a kind of scientific afterlife, no longer glamorous but persistent, almost stoic. And outside the clinic, the molecule continues to wander. Nutrition companies add trace amounts of quinine to energy tonics and soft drinks, more for tradition than therapy. Perfume chemists borrow its aroma, earthy, sharp, faintly woody, to anchor masculine colognes. Even the cosmetics industry nods to it occasionally, touting botanical quinine extract in hair treatments, a marketing echo of its pharmacological past. The bark has become metaphor, its bitterness repackaged as authenticity. Yet the forests that first offered that bitterness remain fragile. Climate change, deforestation, and land conversion continue to shrink. The Andean cloud forests, where wild Cinchona grows, the species are resilient, but not invincible. Researchers who trek through Ecuador and Peru still find Cinchona trees, though scattered and often stunted. The same mist that once protected them now arrives less often, the mountains warming year by year. Conservation programs have tried to replant and catalogue them, but progress is uneven. Funding ebbs and flows with political cycles, and the work demands patience measured in generations. Still, the fact that anyone is trying at all marks a change in perspective. For centuries, the world viewed Cinchona only as a resource, something to extract, refine, and sell. Now it's treated as heritage, both ecological and cultural. Modern field researchers often collaborate with local communities who maintain oral knowledge of where the trees still thrive. Some of those communities can trace their ancestry to the bark collectors of the 17th and 18th centuries. What once was economic subjugation has become, cautiously, scientific partnership. The work is small-scale, unglamorous, but quietly redemptive. In that sense, Quinine's story mirrors a larger shift in how humanity views nature. The industrial century believed in dominion. The current one, at least in theory, leans towards stewardship. Whether practice will follow rhetoric remains uncertain, but there's comfort in the idea that the same forests once raided for empire now host joint research projects, school programs, and ecotourism initiatives. The bark, it seems, is teaching patience again. Meanwhile, in museums and university archives, the artifacts of the Quinine age gather dust. Wooden boxes, labeled Cinchona officinalis, yellowed plantation maps, glass vials still crusted with white residue. These relics have become objects of quiet fascination for historians. They tell a story not only of discovery but of paperwork, the endless documentation that accompanied empire. Every shipment recorded, every dosage debated. Reading those ledgers feels like eavesdropping on a global bureaucracy, learning to speak in milligrams. In those records, the people behind the process rarely appear by name. The chemists and colonial administrators are credited. The indigenous gatherers and Javanese laborers are reduced to numbers. Modern historians have begun the slow work of reintroducing those missing voices. In archives in Quito, Lima, and Amsterdam, researchers sift through letters and field reports that hint at collaboration and coercion in equal measure. The rediscovery is not dramatic. But it's necessary. Empires fade, but the stories they wrote, or failed to write, continue shaping how science remembers itself. The broader public, however, mostly encounters quinine as taste and nostalgia. The modern gin and tonic has become a kind of historical souvenir bitterness, diluted into civility. Trendy mixologists celebrate heritage tonics and artisanal quinine extracts, often without mentioning that the drink originated as a desperate prophylactic against a lethal parasite in the low light of cocktail bars. Few think of bark stripped from trees, or of the colonial soldiers swallowing medicine between battles. The drink's charm lies precisely in that amnesia, its history, carbonated and dressed with citrus. Still, the flavor itself keeps a faint memory alive. Bitterness resists simplification. It demands acknowledgement. You can sweeten it, chill it, drown it in gin, but it remains a small reminder that survival is rarely pleasant. The tonic waters glow under black light, pretty and useless, feels like the perfect symbol of quinine's twilight role, a medicine turned aesthetic, a warning turned decoration. The scientific community, however, continues to find new angles on the old molecule. Quinine and its derivatives have been studied for potential uses beyond malaria, antiarrhythmic properties in cardiology, mild analgesic effects, even as templates for new antimalarial combinations. Its chirality, the way the molecule twists light, remains a textbook example for teaching stereochemistry. Students who may never see a malaria patient still learn how quinine bends photons, and by extension, human history. The moral weight of that history hangs lightly now, but it's there. When scientists discuss biopiracy or benefit sharing, they often cite quinine as the prototype case. It reminds policymakers that global health has roots not in neutral science, but in colonial exchange. Every modern pharmaceutical supply chain, from rainforest plants to laboratory patents, exists in the shadow of that earlier trade. The bitter bark taught the world to value discovery, but also to question ownership. Somewhere between nostalgia and accountability, quinine continues to float, refusing to settle into myth or irrelevance. It's too human for myth, too messy, too full of ledgers and logistics, and it's too durable for irrelevance. Every time malaria threatens to outsmart the latest synthetic medical journals quietly note that quinine still works, still waits in the pharmacopoeia, still knows its old enemy. On the consumer side, the molecule's role has taken one last detour through irony. Social media trends occasionally celebrate natural remedies, with influencers praising Cinchona bark as a traditional detox. They rarely mention that pure bark can be toxic in large doses, or that actual quinine is regulated for good reason. The same internet that democratizes information also recycles half-truths with cheerful confidence. The bark, patient as ever, endures another cycle of misunderstanding. Yet, even that misinformation has a small, unintended grace. It keeps the plant's name alive in a world that forgets easily. Remembering, even imperfectly, has its own kind of value. People may not know the difference between cinchona and cinnamon, but the syllables persist, whispering faintly through wellness blogs and cocktail menus. History, distilled into taste and trivia, still breathes. If there's comfort to be found in the quinine story, it lies in its persistence. Every civilization, it seems, learns the same lesson about medicine, that every cure carries a cost, and every discovery arrives wrapped in context. Quinine just lived that lesson more vividly than most. It crossed oceans, cured fevers, fueled empires, and outlived them all. Its bitterness, once hated, became its strength, a reminder that not all healing is sweet. As the 21st century moves further into its own entanglements of science, ecology, and ethics, the bark's long journey still offers a map. It traces the path from extraction to understanding, from domination to dialogue, and perhaps, if humanity learns to listen more carefully, the next cure born from some distant forest will come without the same colonial aftertaste. But the story isn't finished yet, because quinine's legacy, like its taste, lingers on the tongue of history, a reminder that even in our most modern moments, we still live inside the consequences of what we once swallowed. The story drifts now toward its ending, though endings in history are never as tidy as they look from a distance. Quinine's tale closes not with discovery or disaster, but with something quieter, the long aftertaste of empire, and the slow recognition that every cure leaves a mark on both the body and the world that produced. In the old Andean forests, the Cinchona trees still stand in patches of cloud and shadow. They grow where the air feels too thin for speech, and the ground smells of wet stone. Most people passing through wouldn't know what they were looking at. The bark appears ordinary, greyish, flaky, slightly sweet-smelling when cut. Only those who have tasted it understand its defiance. Even now, villagers sometimes collect small pieces, drying and grinding them for home remedies. A fever, a chill, an ache, the same gestures their ancestors made centuries ago, long before ships, missionaries, or laboratories entered the story. For scientists visiting today, those trees represent a living archive. DNA analysis has begun to map the genetic history of Cinchona officinalis and its relatives, tracing how centuries of trade and transplantation blurred the line between wild and cultivated. Many of the Javanese varieties, once considered separate species, turn out to be hybrids, descendants of seeds smuggled by Charles Ledger and crossed with Andean stock. The empire that tried so hard to classify everything left behind a botanical family tree as tangled as its politics. The forests are quieter now, but their silence holds memory. When the wind moves through the canopies, it carries the faint sound of paper, a rustle that could be leaves, or maybe the echo of all those ledgers and laboratory notes that once defined the bark by numbers instead of roots. The global trade that stripped the trees nearly bare also connected the world in ways it could never quite undo. Quinine was one of the first truly international medicines, and its story still sits at the crossroads of science, commerce, and conscience. In the decades since its discovery, medicine has learned to move faster. Today, a new compound can travel from rainforest to clinical trial in a fraction of the time it once took to reach a port. But the ethical questions quinine left behind remain uncomfortably relevant. When researchers find a promising molecule in a remote ecosystem, who gets to claim it? The scientist who isolates it, the company that develops it, or the community that already knew its effects for generations? The world has more treaties now, more paperwork and committees, but the answers still taste a little bitter. That bitterness, in a strange way, may be quinine's final gift. It refuses to let the story become too comfortable. The bark reminds us that progress has a texture, a mix of gratitude and regret, success and death. The same molecule that saved millions also taught humanity how easily compassion can become commerce. The Cinchona tree, indifferent to our dramas, continues to grow and shed bark in cycles that ignore borders. And yet, in small ways, the world has begun to circle back. Modern pharmacologists and historians sometimes collaborate with indigenous healers to document traditional plant knowledge ethically. acknowledging sources and sharing credit. Universities sponsor biocultural heritage programs that teach students both chemistry and context. It's not perfect, but it's something, a slow unlearning of the arrogance that once turned a cure into a conquest. Outside the forest, quinine's ghost has settled into culture more than medicine. Its name appears on bottles of artisanal tonic water, on perfume labels, on minimalist bar menus that present bitterness as sophistication. The drinkers who savor it now are far removed from the soldiers who once grimaced through their daily doses. They raise their glasses in comfort, unaware that the same fizz was once a survival strategy. The irony, though, doesn't diminish the beauty, it only deepens it. Bitterness, it seems, has always been the flavor of endurance. In that sense, the gin and tonic remains a quiet monument to history's contradictions. The lime and bubbles disguise what the empire could not. That salvation often comes with an aftertaste. You can almost imagine the ghosts of colonial officers, chemists, and Andean collectors sitting together in some timeless veranda, each nursing the same drink, each tasting something different. For the officers, perhaps relief. For the chemists, pride. For the collectors, a bitterness that never quite fades. Meanwhile, in hospitals across the world, quinine still does its work, quietly, efficiently, without ceremony. Nurses hang IV drips of quinine sulfate for patients whose malaria has resisted newer drugs. The treatment is old-fashioned, but it still pulls lives back from fever. The molecule hasn't changed in centuries. Its job remains the same: interfere, interrupt, survive. In that sense, it mirrors humanity itself. There's a kind of humility in that constancy. The same substance that once served kings and conquerors now serves anyone who needs it. No ceremony, no empire, just chemistry doing what chemistry does. And perhaps that's where the story finally finds its balance. Not in power, but in persistence. The Cinchona tree doesn't care who owns it, who names it, or who profits from its bark. It just grows where conditions allow, offering its bitterness freely to anyone willing to taste it. Looking back, quinine's journey seems impossibly vast. From a single Andean slope to the shelves of apothecaries, from Jesuit powder to tonic bubbles, from colonial lifeline to cocktail ingredient. Along the way, it shaped the language of medicine, the geography of empire, and the ethics of discovery. Few substances have traveled so far or changed so many things simply by existing. If history were fair, the story would end in gratitude, one long toast to the bark that saved the world from fever. But fairness isn't really history's strong suit. Instead, the story ends as it began, with a taste dry, lingering, slightly medicinal, the kind of flavor that wakes you up, just enough to think, then lets you drift back into reflection. Somewhere tonight, in a city far from the Andes, someone will raise a glass of tonic water under soft light. They'll notice the faint bitterness, the glow beneath ultraviolet, the way the drink feels both modern and ancient. They won't think of fever or empire or bark stripped from mountain trees, but the molecule will still be there, unchanged, drifting through the bloodstream, doing nothing except what it always has, reminding the world, in its quiet chemical way, that healing and history share the same taste. And in that small act, the sip, the swallow, the sigh, you can almost feel the centuries collapsing into a single subtle moment of recognition. The bark's journey is complete, yet never over. The forest still breathes, the tonic still glows, the bitterness endures.